Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Centre Culturel Irlandais. And tonight, the Centre Culturel Irlandais and the Embassy of Ireland in Paris are delighted to present this first edition of St. Brigid's Day in Paris. And we are joined by two strong voices of Irish theatre and cinema. Renowned Irish actor, theatre writer and director Olwen Fouéré, and distinguished filmmaker Pat Murphy. So we will begin with a reading by Olwen Fouéré of a monologue from the play Ballyturk by Enda Walsh. And then we'll welcome Alexandra Slabby, lecturer at the Université de Caen, who will lead an interview with Olwen's work and the strong lead roles that she's played throughout her career. And then filmmaker Pat Murphy will be in conversation with Luke Dodd. And we're very happy to welcome Luke back. We were reminiscing. It was actually my first exhibition back here, not programmed by me, I can't take credit for it, but by Sheila Pratchka back in 2013, an exhibition that Luke curated of the artist Vivian Dick. And to close then, the four guests will take the stage and will be able to answer your questions. So if I could ask you now to welcome the Irish ambassador to France, Patricia O'Brien, who will open this evening's proceedings.
Madame la directrice, mesdames et messieurs, chers amis. So it's a great pleasure to be with you on this Friday, St. Brigid's Day. I'm really honored to have been asked by Nora if I would do a few introductory remarks before the evening begins. It's a great pleasure for me, a delight to meet Olwen for the first time. And I haven't met Pat before, but Olwen, I was at Trinity in the late 70s, and already at that stage, I think, and certainly the early 80s, I remember your name and thinking, this is somebody that I really want to meet. So here we are all these years later, and I'm absolutely delighted. So I thought I'd give you a sense of what St. Brigid's Day means to us at the Embassy and why we chose to celebrate it. I've had a very, very intense day at the Embassy. Maybe one or two of you, yes, have joined us throughout the day. But we started this morning with a panel discussion for women in business in France and in Ireland. Really the focus being gender empowerment and gender issues, followed then by a lunch for 30 people with some great speakers at both events. Largely women, one or two men allowed in, but really extraordinary discussions. But for me, the delight of anticipating an evening such as this that we're going to have kept me going throughout, as I say, this very, very intense day. And of course, one subject that has been on our minds, certainly mine for the last 2.5 years since I arrived here in Paris, and has been occupying every minute, basically, of every day, is the Brexit negotiations. And today is the big Brexit day. But of course, St. Brigid has now completely surmounted Brexit in our minds. Luckily for us in Ireland, this is what we're thinking of, and I think it's something that we will remember always, and we hope to continue to celebrate St. Brigid's Day, certainly in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and we hope that the other issue somehow manages to filter away after a few years anyway. So as many of you know, February the 1st honours St. Brigid, 5th century nun from County Kildare, reputed to have performed miracles and to have healed the sick. The legend of Brigid stretches back to pre-Christian mythology. She was a goddess associated with poets, healers, childbirth, and inspiration. Thus, St. Brigid's Day, originally a pagan festival known as Imbolc, marked the beginning of spring. So today is the beginning of spring for us all. In the last few years, the Department of Foreign Affairs has reinvented this traditional day to project an image of a modern Ireland. The aim is to celebrate the work of trailblazing, inspirational Irish women who are making their mark across a range of fields. So this year was the first year that we celebrated St. Brigid's Day at the Embassy, or indeed here. Our colleagues at the Embassy in London hosted the inaugural St. Brigid's Day event 2 years ago. Building on the success of the past 2 years, this year will see over 30 diplomatic missions choosing to celebrate this day. I believe that the discussion this evening will touch on social change in Ireland. In my experience, even in a close neighbour like France, people are often surprised at the degree of social change that has occurred in Ireland in recent years. I found this throughout all my discussions as a diplomat here in Paris, that there's verging on astonishment at how we have changed. So let's hope that that change is there to stay and that we continue to inspire, as we have done over the last few years, other countries around the world to look at Ireland as a liberal, outward-looking, progressive country. So we see Brigid's Day as a modern and alternative way of celebrating Irishness to St. Patrick's Day. The aim is to raise the profile of Irish women across a wide range of sectors, to learn from the experiences of these trailblazing women, and to explore the challenges and obstacles which women continue to face. I've mentioned the two events that we had. I was delighted that it was possible. In fact, the department enthusiastically responded when asked to support this evening's event. And of course, we're going to celebrate through our wonderful panel and our speakers, and Alexandra, it's just lovely to see you again this evening, which will celebrate the creativity, the ingenuity, and the talent of Irish women and interrogate their struggles and triumphs. The conversations are just as important as the two that we had earlier. For culture, it both determines and is determined by the norms and mores of society. Oscar Wilde reckoned that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. It's certainly true that art can set the bar for young women's dreams and aspirations, and it has the power to either reinforce or reshape power dynamics in society. And this is something that is often missed or not recognized. The arts world is arguably more affected than others by the scandals of gender inequality and sexism. The Me Too movement has sparked a wider debate about gender issues and power dynamics writ large, but of course it started in Hollywood. In the arts, as in most other domains of life, there's never been a level playing field for women. As a result, for so long, many women had no outlet for their creativity, and those rare exceptions, like Eileen Gray, who were often denied the recognition that they rightly deserved. While today she's considered one of the most innovative designers of her time, Gray was arguably Ireland's most underappreciated genius for decades. Her omission from the canon of modern architecture is a particularly relevant example, certainly for us here in France, of a type of injustice and unfair treatment which women artists have faced everywhere. The job of maintaining and cultivating the cultural canon has for centuries been a male prerogative, and the biases that exist within that canon are the inevitable result. Not a single woman is memorialized among the 40 marble busts that adorn the long room in my alma mater, Trinity. More generally, women remain dramatically underrepresented in our national cultural institutions. The role of institutional gatekeepers is crucial here. Female representation is higher when there are more women gatekeepers, and that is clear right across the spectrum of activities. No better example than the Centre Culturel, where Nora and her team routinely celebrate the pioneering work of women artists, and I'm always proud to be able to assist whenever I can. So ladies and gentlemen, it's an exciting time for Irish women artists, and there's indeed much to celebrate. In literature alone, a new wave of women writers has emerged from our small island. From Sally Rooney, Anna Burns, Sinead Gleeson, Emily Pine, our female authors are winning universal acclaim. Jan Carson, who's currently resident here at the CCI, who I haven't yet met, won the EU Prize for Literature in 2019. Here in France, Edna O'Brien was awarded the prestigious Prix Femina in November for her entire body of work. 2 weeks from now, Irish composer Emer Noon will be the first woman to conduct an orchestra at the Oscars. At the same Academy Awards, of course, Saoirse Ronan is in the running for the Best Actress Award, having received her fourth Oscar nomination at only 25 years of age. A bit unnerving, that. All this to say that we've a lot to celebrate this evening, and indeed a lot of questions to ask. So I'm looking forward to hearing Olwen and Pat and their experiences and insights into this fascinating subject. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nora. And I look forward very much to this evening ahead.
There's a woman, and she wakes alone. Her eyes open, and she's conscious of her first breath, of her first movement, of her first thought, which may be of food, or maybe to shuffle herself to her bathroom and relieve herself. And those first beginnings lie on top of 23,000 mornings where she has aged invisibly, definitely, where she carries half-remembered bits of her life, of the people she has met and hated and loved, of her brothers and sisters who were once her world and now only exist to make her feel older. She carries 1 billion pictures of life that have no consequence to her, and a few pictures which will always haunt or please her. She's made from purpose and mistake, and controlled by the movement of this planet around a star. Yet in the second she's led by some great need or some little urgency. Only occasionally she's conscious that around her life is beginning and ending to the beat of time, that millions of others are walking in the exact same moment that she is, are traveling with the same purpose but with singular histories, but traveling nonetheless with the same basic need to keep on living. How unremarkable and how faintly unique it is to wake and walk in this way, with doors pushing open into a sky bizarrely blue, giving to us systems of weather, shaping us with forever movable seasons. And too hard it is to think how rain is made, how the sun can push light through darkness, and what it is that holds us up here imperceptibly in space. That this woman stands and walks in life as it is now, with geographies to navigate, with journeys to her work, to lunches, to beaches, to churches, to secret meetings with potential lovers, to parks, to another part of the village, or town, or city, or countries even. A lifetime of walking distances in the vain hope of making things that bit more fulfilling, of packing her time with experiences, some of which will change her greatly, and others with no consequence other than wasting a little more of her life. And to stand there in the magnificence of this world, with all these animals and plants and trees, too many to ever imagine clearly, and standing with the you as was made, in a life that is so chaotically structured by nature, to continue living, to remain upright, and to be able to carry on searching for something other than what you have. Some love, or money, or experience, or cat, or or sun or anything at all. Something which makes you continue without the mindfulness of it all ending at any moment. For everything is here, and we are here to lay down legacy, to give life purpose by reaching its edge. And it's time for you too, and for what you've made. Time for one of you to walk away and into your passing. In leaving, you're giving shape to life, some design and purpose for being what you are. For this is the order that all life demands. It needs a death. That was a monologue from Ballyturk by Enda Walsh. The character's name is called Three. There are 3 characters in the play, 1, 2, and 3. And 3 was originally written for the actor Stephen Ray, or at least Stephen Ray played that role in the very first production of Ballyturk. But when Ballyturk was being remounted and going to New York, Enda Walsh asked me would I play 3. So I said yes, I'd love to, because I absolutely adore that particular monologue that I've just done. And I said yes, I'd love to. And I imagined I would be playing it as a man. I had my whole Leonard Cohen look worked out and everything like that, and you know, my Stephen Ray, my reference to Stephen Ray. And then Enda said, "Oh no, you're playing it as a woman." So I was slightly disappointed at the time, but in fact, I did play it as a woman, and it works much better as a woman, that particular role. So anyway, that's what it was. But it's one of my favorite monologues that I've done in recent years. So I just wanted to give it to you because it even though written by a man, well, Enda is kind of in-betweeny like me, but he really understands that whole thing about that, the life, basically. And the role of 3 is actually, she kind of represents death. So this is also her internal monologue about her endless life and how it is.
Thank you so much, Olwen. First, I want to thank Nora for this invitation. I want to thank Madam Ambassador. I want to thank you all, members of the Irish community in Paris, for their tremendous honor that I received in the form of this invitation. I'm so happy to be here and to be in the presence of Olwen Fouéré, who is a trailblazing female figure after St. Brigid, who was an early defender of peace and human rights and contributor to the arts. Another such trailblazing female figure is Olwen Fouéré, who I just want to put this performance in the bigger picture of her career, which spans 4 decades. She's a multi-award-winning actress. She's a creative artist. She's an artistic director. She was born in Ireland, but of French Breton parents. And her work and her career are just the exemplification of a circulation of gender representations, circulation of theatrical traditions. And her work has been produced in theatres across the globe, Ireland, the UK, France, the US, the Bouffe du Nord, the BAM, Lincoln Center, Australia. In Ireland, she created the role of Salome in the internationally acclaimed production of Oscar Wilde's Salome, directed by Steven Berkoff, which premiered at the Gate Theatre. And more recently, she created her own company, the Emergency Room for, and I love this expression, projects in need of immediate attention. And one notable piece of creative work she has produced there, and which made a great impression on me when I saw it, was River Run, where she gives voice to the river in Finnegan's Wake, and which premiered at the Galway Arts Festival in 2013. So, Olwen, you have broken new ground in so many ways, and your, as I said, your career expresses the circulation between male and female roles. Indeed, you played male roles in the past. You have been asked to play male roles. You have been asked to play female roles. I was struck by the one of your works in Jesse Jones' live installation, Tremble, Tremble, which represented Ireland at the Venice Biennale. And it was all about feminist issues, the name echoing Italian feminist activists taking to the street to the sound of Tremble, Tremble, the witches are back. And so you've been in... You have been in works that have promoted very affirmative female roles, and at the moment, I believe you are working on a film that is playing a male CEO that is played by a woman, and I'm intrigued by your whole body of work, and I would like to ask you today, as we celebrate St. Brigid and women artists, I would like to ask you to what extent your performance and your creative work is inspired by gender representation issues.
Well, I think when I started off as an actor, I don't mind being called an actress, actually. I don't mind. I'm fine about that. But well, I always say actor. When I started off as an actor, I do remember this sense of pressure to interpret female roles a certain way. So that, I think, may have... It's always when you encounter a difficulty like that that a door opens, I think. It may have inspired me to start to create my own work. But it wasn't just about gender, it was about form as well. I think the forms of theatre that I was surrounded with in Ireland, while every bit as valid and everything else as anything I would do, but I felt that the forms themselves didn't offer me an opportunity to explore the questions and the different dimensions of reality that I wanted to explore. So I then began working with a composer called Roger Doyle, and we created a company where with music as a core element. And in fact, my very first solo show was an intergendered creature. It was called The Diamond Body, and it was a male. I was playing a male who was undergoing a gender transformation to be both genders. So that was 1984, so you can imagine that was kind of quite early on in terms of Ireland, I suppose. Now I probably wouldn't be able to do that because the trans community would have issues with me playing, as I'm not trans, me playing a trans role. There's a lot of politics around that at the moment, but it's interesting. I mean, I think it's great, but it's interesting how things move along. So to a certain extent, my work would be informed by gender, but it's kind of inseparable from the other aspects of form that interested me.
So you wouldn't primarily identify yourself as a feminist artist?
No, I wouldn't use that label. But I don't like to use a label. But I would definitely support all feminist issues, absolutely. But I have been identified as a feminist artist, but I don't necessarily. I don't use it for myself,
Mm-hmm. I was struck by something that you said in an interview that you gave after a performance of yours. A child saying that he just didn't know what you were, if you were a man or a woman, or
when I was a child.
A child seeing your performance and being totally.
Yes, that was when I was playing the role of Antonin Artaud. I did this live installation where I am inspired by Artaud's visit to Ireland in 1937. And I used material from the file on him that is in the National Archives, specifically a letter that he wrote back to Ireland to retrieve things that were taken away from him in Ireland. At this point, he was in an asylum. And so I'd always wanted to do something around this visit of Artaud to Ireland, where he brought St. Patrick's staff with him, or some in other versions of the story, it's the staff of Jesus Christ that he used in the desert. But he came to Ireland with a very specific mission, was to reconnect, to return this staff to its origins, to its druidic origins. And his letters are very interesting to read. And anyway, this was the final journey he ever made in his life. He was arrested. He was eventually arrested. He went to the Aran Islands for 2 weeks and ended up in Dublin, and was eventually arrested for creating a disturbance. And he was deported as a destitute and undesirable alien from Ireland. Anyway, I was very keen to do something around this. I'm not the only one. There are several filmmakers who've wanted to make a film about this, but I think Artaud is like a trickster spirit. He's in the ether there, usually stops things from actually reaching fulfillment. But this piece, I resisted playing the figure of Artaud, but the person I was working with said, no, you've got to play him. So I said, okay, I played the figure of Artaud. So I had this very elaborate, like 3-hour makeup job and latex and everything, and actually wore one of my father's old suits, and did all that. And it was a durational piece. It lasted about 5 hours, but each section of it was 10 minutes, and then it would repeat itself. So anyway, I'm going off on a tangent to tell you about it. But one of my favorite audiences was a group of French people. This was in Galway. The very premiere was in Galway, and it was a group of French people who came in to see this. And of course, once they go into the room, the door is closed and it's dark, and they're up against this box, and I'm in this glass box, and they're right up against the window. And they were all giggling and making fun and all of that. There was lots of kids. And then they got quieter and quieter as the performance continued. And at the very end of the performance, what I do is I look up and I realize that I am being watched. That's part of it. So I would meet each person's eyes. And I met this eyes of a 12-year-old boy. And it was one of the best exchanges I've had, because he was looking at me like, what are you? And before that, I'd heard him when he, earlier on in the installation, there was a bit where I got up off the bed, and then I could hear him saying, "Oh, il est tout petit." He's only a little fella. So anyway, there are moments like that which make it all worthwhile, where you've actually planted an experience which that person is not going to forget, or maybe going to disturb them, but that's a good thing.
Yes, are you seen in Ireland as bringing this continental tradition in theatre?
Say that again, Alexander.
Are you perceived in Ireland as someone who brings this continental tradition, French and continental tradition in theatre?
Well, to a certain extent, yeah. But I mean, for the first, I'd say 10 or 15 years of my work, I was just, I do weird stuff. That was what I was seen as, doing mainly weird stuff. Off-the-wall stuff. But it was actually when I started to experience more European theatre, I began to realize that it was in my DNA, and that was what was coming out. So I felt less weird, and I think as my work matured, and as my acceptability increased, I think, yes, that people would have maybe associated my work with European influence, definitely. And they would know that that's where a lot of my interests would lie. I mean, I've always found it strange that Ireland references England and America in a lot of its literature, or not so much the literature actually, but in a lot of its theatre and film. And there is such an incredible rich tradition in both of those disciplines, theatre and film, in Europe, and how little connection and conversation, actually, artistic conversation goes on between Ireland and Europe in those areas. So it's changing, but it's always been a passion of mine to try and see that exchange happen more.
And to dissolve boundaries, as dissolving boundaries in gender representations and dissolving boundaries as well in theatre traditions all over the place.
And categorization as well. I mean, even you know, like in Ireland, we have a really great system for artists, a tax system for artists, but you have to fall into a particular category to be eligible for it. You have to be a writer, a painter. Well, it used to be you have to actually paint something, but now an artist, you know, it can be a digital artist. It can be, but there are still these categorizations of art forms, which don't really help the advancement of art, I think.
But concerning art and the capacity of art or the mission of art, there was a wonderful quotation that I can't resist reading that you gave as part of an interview to RTE1 in 2014 as part of the arts program, The Works. And where you said, theatre is about envisioning and expanding the boundaries of our imagination and expanding the possibilities of our reality. Art and theatre are about opening all those portals to the higher experience and more intense experience of of fundamentally being alive and of our relationship with the world, with the universe, with everything. And would it be right to say that for you, theatre performance also challenges not only yourself, but also actors and viewers to transcend the boundaries of physical reality, to transcend the idea of rootedness. And I was wondering if that very fluid framework that you have, spanning continents, I was wondering if that came from your own intercultural background, and I was wondering where you felt at home culturally. Where is your soul at home, and where do you find your source of inspiration?
So, are you asking me about home? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, I'm quite impressed by what I said in that interview. I must get it from you. Thank you, Alexandra. Home is a strange question. I mean, I believe that home is about place. I believe in the power of place, first of all, and the place that I grew up is a very powerful place. So I have an attachment to it, and it definitely forged my identity in many ways. But at the same time, I do feel rootless in the most positive way. A friend of mine who was part of from Sarajevo, you know, when Yugoslavia no longer exists, and she was being interviewed about all that. She's an artist, and she said, you know, they asked her how did she feel about the fact that she's from a country that no longer exists, even though the place is still there. And she said, well, you know, people are not trees. Do they really need roots? And there is something in that.
Thing to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel that a little bit myself. I feel freer the more I expand my sense of belonging. We belong to the world. We belong to the cosmos.
Yes, indeed. But you have a home in Paris right now because you have a residency here.
This is my home right now. Thank you, Nora.
And can I bring you back to your collaboration with French authors and notably with Laurent Godet? Can you talk to us about your collaboration with Laurent Godet, who wrote a play for you? Laurent Godet, who earned the Prix Goncourt with Le Soleil d'Escorta in 2004, and who wrote a play for you, Danse Morobe, in 2016 about dirty protests by the IRA prisoners in Northern Ireland. And more recently, he wrote a powerful text called L'Europe Banquet des Peuples, 2019, which makes compelling reading, particularly on a day like this. And it seems to me that this text has very important things to say to us about boundaries in Europe, about the circulation of ideas. But perhaps you could talk to us a bit more about the fruit of that collaboration with Laurent Godet.
So, Laurent Godet, I met him because I was actually here. I was here at the time. I'm trying to remember what year it was. I think it was 2009. I was here for a short time. I had just finished doing a production called Paula Spencer, La femme qui se cognait dans les portes, which toured around. And the Centre Culturel was a co-producer on it. And I came back to just have some quiet time like I'm going to have now. And I read about, in Le Monde, I read about this new play that had just been published called Sodome ma douce by Laurent Godet. And I thought, God, that's a really intriguing title. So I read a little bit more about it in the article, and it said it was about a woman who had been buried in salt for thousands of years, and it starts to rain, and she comes to life. And she tells the story of, she is the last survivor of the city of Sodom, and she tells a story of how Sodom was destroyed, which is, of course, totally different to the biblical story. And so I went everywhere trying to find this book, because it literally had just been printed, and I got it. I sat down in Place de la Sorbonne about 11 o'clock at night and read it in one sitting, and the next morning phoned the ACD to find out about the rights, because I said, I have to do this play. And that's how it all started, my relationship with Laurent Godet. And a company called Rough Magic agreed to produce it. And I put a little bit of, the emergency room it was a co-production with the emergency room. And it had its world premiere in my translation in English in Ireland the following year. And Laurent obviously came over and everything like that. I'll read a little bit from that actually at the end. But so that's how it all started. And then Laurent and I kept in touch. I adore his writing. And we just kept in touch. And then one day he said to me, I'd really like us to do something else together. And so then he wrote this piece, a piece called Danse Marobe, which I then translated. And in Danse Marobe, he actually uses elements of my family life, particularly my father's. He actually describes my father's funeral in the play because I had sent him a video that was on Agence Bretagne Presse of the funeral, which was quite extraordinary with singing, and it was amazing, and a high mass in Breton and all of this sort of thing. It was very beautiful, and this extraordinary moment where they blessed the coffin with flags. So that's actually in the play. So then we kind of collaborated on it for a while, and then I translated it. And he came. I translated it here actually, and he came once a week, and we'd go over it, and then produced it the following year. I kind of half did it for Laurent as well as for myself, really, because it's such a valuable relationship to me. But I did have worries about it, because obviously referencing the dirty protest, as the English say it, the Irish say it, it's a different way of describing it. But anyway, I had some worries about it, because I felt, well, yes, I lived through all that, but I was in the South. And as my now very good friend Lawrence McKeown, who was one of the hunger strikers, said to me, well, he always uses the phrase Southern ignorance. And I was part of that Southern ignorance, really, even though I knew what was going on. But that's a whole long story, as you know. So that was the last piece I did with them, and then this final piece, Nous l'Europe, Banquet des Peuples, which we premiered in Avignon in the Avignon Festival last July. I was asked to be part of that via Laurent, and it was directed by Roland Osé. And it's actually on tour now, but I'm not doing the tour because I just it clashed with other work that I had, and I needed to stop. But I hope to continue working with Laurent. I just think he's an extraordinary writer. For me, he's a sort of like the magic realist writer, really. He's very unlike other French writers I've read, but maybe I haven't read very many.
Is magic realism a movement that inspires you in your work?
I would say so, yeah. Yeah.
And what ideas, what inspiring ideas about the future or about the circulation of ideas in Europe do you find in Laurent Godet's work? I mean, on this day when Brexit is happening, what can we keep from his work?
Well, I mean, his work really doesn't refer to Europe hardly at all, apart from this last piece, Nous l'Europe, Banquet de Peuple. His other work is very influenced by other cultures. He spent a lot of time in Haiti. He spent a lot of time in Beirut. So a lot of his work references the culture there or the conflicts that were there. Anyway, you just need to read him, really. But
yes, it's
it's
a very rich body of work.
Yeah, and Nous l'Europe is actually my least favorite of his texts. But I'd said I'd do it before he'd written it, so I had to do it. But he understands completely. But Nous l'Europe is more like a big history lesson. It goes way back to the formation of Europe, and it's useful from that point of view. And I suppose in terms of the future, he was very much looking to explore the utopic idea of Europe, you know, of how do we get past all of these economic and other barriers and make it into a utopic idea, really, you know, because it was founded originally, my brother here who's a EU expert, but he'll probably correct me, but it was founded originally on you know, for economic reasons, as far as I know. You can correct me later, but and so he really wanted to bring this into a much bigger idea, philosophic and spiritual and border dissolving and the right of people to speak their own languages at the same time, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, long answer, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, thank you
but
so much.
I definitely recommend it. What we did is actually we broke it, we deconstructed it so it doesn't follow a chronology. So we kind of threw it all up in the air. So, you know, you'll get now and then you'll get, you know, an early time. So it works better that way. And then there's I played this kind of interrogator, who's kind of border person, interrogating an Arabic person, a horrible border person, interrogating an Arabic person who's an economic migrant. So I played these interrogations that are leafed through it, which are not in the actual text that you would buy. And that was quite interesting to play, actually.
Was it a challenge translating Sodom Madous?
Yeah, it was a challenge. And actually, I've been looking back over it. And I was going, I think I have to retranslate this now. If it's ever going to be published, which I don't know if it will be, but I haven't tried to get it published. But the Oberon Press is kind of interested in it. But I was looking over it saying I would translate it differently. At the time, I really wanted to translate it very, very, very faithfully and literally, because I wanted the woman in the text to not sound like English was her first language, or you know, to sound foreign. I wanted her to sound kind of foreign, not with an accent, but construction-wise. So it was quite interesting when you directly translate, you know. I mean, there was one sentence that took me all night to translate. I remember staying up all night. I said, God almighty, how do writers do it? But there was a sentence which was about the fire, and the person in Sodom is looking at the Gomorrah as burning, and says, le souffle du feu a fait fonder nos âmes, which literally means the breath of the fire made our souls melt. And I thought, I can't say that. That sounds terrible. So I went around and around. Eventually I came up with the breath of the fire changed the shape of our souls. I was happy with that. But that's the kind of struggle.
I'm quite sure. Yeah. I teach translation, so I'm fascinated by all these choices. Did you say that you had brought a passage from your translation to share with us?
Yeah, this is going to be our closing bit. Yeah.
And so it would be lovely if you could read us out on
I'll
this.
I'll read
Thank
it
you.
out. It's on my phone. Sorry, I didn't get time to print it, so I just have to get it up here. Okay. My city disappeared completely, swallowed by dunes of sand, dust, and earth. My executioners grew old and died, leaving their sons to watch over their empire. Their sons, in turn, declined with age, and their children too, but I endured. I was nothing more than a salty residue of life, but I endured. I thought about my revenge. I imagined the day I might breathe again. I wanted a reprisal greater than the violence I had suffered. I wanted to return and overturn the world. I knew that my executioners would no longer be there, that I would find only the distant offspring of my enemies, men for whom my story had no meaning. I knew, but I did not care. I wanted to burn their eyes, destroy all that is joyful, kill their children, and let their elders weep. I would dream of those moments of destruction and blood. I was ready to tear the world apart. But the rain has fallen, a heavy summer rain which has freed me from the salt. Once more, I have felt the pleasure of moving my limbs. The air has filled my lungs again. The moment I return to life, I knew there will be no more blood. I want no more of that. I am a woman on whom the rain falls, nothing more. I have lost so many of my own. The very thought of battle sickens me. I will not fight. Who would I make pay? I have no more executioners. There is nobody left but you, who have forgotten me. I will live. I am entering your cities, and I will leave the unknown scent of Sodom in my wake. First, it will intrigue you. Then it will disturb you. That is good. My rage demands only that I take back my life from the point at which you ended it. I will not fight. I have found better. A voluptuous revenge. You have forgotten me, but I will remind you. I am returning to haunt you. The seed of your progenitors told you that we were depraved bitches, and you have anxiously kept your distance from our memory. But I will sweep away all of that. You have never seen anything like me. I come from too far. I am the world as it could have been if Sodom and Gomorrah had survived. I am the face of what has been hidden from you. I will teach you what I know. Contagion. Do you remember? That is the weapon I will use.
Very nice to be here with my friend Pat Murphy, who I've known for more than 40 years.
Hello.
I thought before we get into some specifics about Pat's work, it might be useful if she explained about the 3 films she made in Ireland, one which was screened here last night, Anne Devlin, which was made in 1983. Maeve, a film which was made in Belfast in about 1980, and then Nora, which was made in 1999. But just before Pat does that, just to explain that, particularly with Anne Devlin, film in Ireland kind of didn't exist before that. Big companies would come in, and lots of Irish actors would be hired as extras, and this huge machinery would come into town. I suppose David Lean was the great one, or they. But Anne Devlin was actually the first film that was funded entirely within Ireland itself. So Pat was a kind of a pioneer in many respects. So maybe if Pat would talk about the sort of, first of all, about a brief synopsis maybe of the films, and then we'll try and talk about the context in which the films were made. Because from a feminist and a political point of view, they had huge resonances at the time.
Okay. Well, Maeve is, it was made actually in 1981. And what gave rise to it, I had lived in New York, and then I came back to finish an MA at the Royal College of Art, and there was a guy called Di Vaughan who was running a course in documentary film, and as a way of framing his course, he used films that were made about Ireland. So the films he showed were panorama program, like BBC panorama programs, World in Action. And then as a sort of a counterbalance to that, he showed some very left-wing oppositional films, one being Arthur McCaig's Patriot Game, and another being the cinema action film on Ireland. And these films are really interesting to me because they're all dealing with the war, like they're all dealing with the Troubles. But the issue for me that I found problematic about them was that even the leftist documentaries represented a very non-questioning view. And what I felt was that there was something, I don't think of this now, actually, since I've started to make documentaries myself, but at the time, I really felt that there was a flaw in the documentary worldview, because it drew its strength from the notion that I'm here with my camera, therefore this is the truth, and didn't really interrogate how is this truth being constructed. So then I felt, well, you know, in order to unpack the very complex world that is the north of Ireland, where part of my growing up happened, that it had to be approached through fiction, and that it couldn't be straightforward fiction, that it had to be approached with a very particular way of working in mind. So the film that I wrote draws slightly on journals that I'd written when, like, part of the growing up being in Belfast, but also it's memory storytelling. It's dealing with colonialism, representation, women, all of these, nationalism, all of these things, resistance, all of these things, all of these kinds of narratives that people sign up to. But what my intention with the film is that there would be different forms in the way this information was presented, and the meaning would come from the juxtaposition of these kinds of episodes, and it would require a little bit of work on the part of the audience, because nothing was going to signify this is now a flashback, this is now a memory, this is now a political discussion. So there was always this interesting thing with audiences where it cuts to a new kind of episode, and the audience is bringing the information of relating to a fiction out of the last scene. So there's a couple of moments before they realize, oh, I'm in a different world now. So that's really how Maeve got made. And I made it with two friends of mine from the Royal College of Art, John Davis and Rob Smith. And in the making of that film, I met Brigid Brennan. And before I made that film, I knew Ted Hickey, who was a friend, who was Nora's father. And he gave me, he is like a descendant of Anne Devlin, and he gave me a copy of her journals. And I read this on my nights off, which, no nights off, but actually odd moments while I was making Maeve. And
just before we go on to Anne Devlin, but maybe explain that Maeve was made on the streets of Belfast while a war was going on.
Yes. This was the thing. Like, people were, when people made films about the North in that time, usually they used Liverpool or Ringsend in Dublin to represent parts of Belfast. And I was sort of pretty determined that we should make it all in Belfast and roundabout. And I remember convincing John and Rob that this was possible, that it would be okay. And when I look back, I actually think we must have had some guardian angels, because there were moments where the whole thing was extremely dangerous and fell apart. And when I look back at it, I actually, like, if I was more grown up about it, I wouldn't do it now, because you're actually bringing a whole bunch of people into a situation where they could get killed. And that literally nearly happened a couple of times. So, but yet there's nothing in the film that indicates that, because it keeps, like, I can remember having arguments with them while we were making it, because they felt there's this reality going on while we're making the film. Like, we should be filming that. And I'm going, no, no, no. Like, we have to stick with what this is, because what the film we're making is not about something in the moment. It's about underlying structures that inform a moment. So, yeah, so it was kind of a struggle every day to make it. And I think this is quite a long synopsis, no? Sorry.
Longer than the film.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, so Anne Devlin, like, I was interested in her when I read the journals, because she was someone who made a decision and stuck with it, even though she was surrounded by informers and this failed rebellion that lasted just a couple of hours. And her character seems so different to the character of Maeve, because Maeve is someone who's questioning everything and being skeptical about everything, and who seems to have, as a protagonist in a film, has quite a negative relationship to the world and to the people around her. Like, you can't, like, I was very influenced by Godard and Brecht, like, in this thing of preventing identification with the main character. So Anne Devlin presents a different kind of view. So yeah, I don't know. Like, the thing about, I guess, about Anne Devlin was, in Brigid, Brennan was working on Maeve, like, she plays Maeve's younger sister. And when I was reading this book, I knew that if I made the film, that she would be Anne Devlin. So the whole thing is kind of built around her. And the thing, I guess, about it is that it was funded in those days, like, just to give it some context, most films about Ireland would have been funded by, like, Maeve was funded by the BFI, for example, and most sort of radical Irish films of that time, like made by Thaddeus or Joe or Cahill, would have had some funding from the British Film Institute. That was a very radical, interesting institute at the time.
And the beginning of Channel 4.
Yes, exactly. So, like, there was no, apart from the Irish Arts Council or RTE, there was no funding mechanism in Ireland at the time for film. But there was this groundswell of work that was going on by Tierna McBride, Bob Quinn, Joe Comerford, Lelia, like, people who'd been working for years campaigning for the establishment of a film board. So when I moved back to Ireland, like, I was moving in on a wave that they had already set in motion. And so the film board funded Anne Devlin, and one of my main aims was that it should be funded and cast and crewed as much as possible, totally out of Ireland. The reason being that, apart from how radical the BFI was, most material that was made about Ireland would be funded by, say, the BBC and or ITV, and they would kind of control the material in a way and dictate, you know. So if they did a play for the day about the north of Ireland, for example, it would be this fuzzy humanist film about stoic people having this war imposed on them, and their sense of agency would be suddenly eroded. And, like, for us at that time, it was incredibly important that you controlled the kind of material that was being made, like that it was part of what I guess was like a post-colonial sensibility at the time, like, which was a major public academic debate. So yes, so Anne Devlin got made. Part of the reason, like, we'll talk about that a bit later on, but then I thought, oh, great, you know, I made Maeve in 81, I shot Anne Devlin in 83. I get the way this works. Every 2 years you get to make a film. And then, you know, there's this long drought before Nora is made in 99. So one of the things I learned is a huge part of the process of filmmaking is not on the screen. You know, a huge part of the process is getting the funding. And then I also learned actually, like without whinging, because I actually feel that I'm not really a person that's ever functioned in a film industry. So for me, someone like me to get to make a film is an immense privilege. Like, because basically I'm not in that world. I step out of it after a film is made. And then when I want to make a film again, then I have to construct the whole thing from the beginning. So I'm not in a world that's carried by, yeah.
And kind of all the films you've made, you've written and you've directed. So you've had a degree of control over them that, I mean, you don't do jobbing directing work.
No, I've tried to do that, but the films never, like I've written scripts for people, but the films themselves never kind of work out because I don't function well with producers who have a lot of scripts and the one I'm part of is on a back burner somewhere. And I think the only things for me that have really happened is when I'm driving them, and then if something is not happening about them, then I know why, you know.
Maybe before we talk about Nora, because it almost is another phase,
Yeah.
we should talk about the kind of things you were looking at to inform the way in which you made Anne Devlin and Maeve, because
Yes.
while they're, they follow some conventions of cinema, they deviate fairly radically in certain respects as well. So what were you looking at the time?
Well, there's a few things. Like when I was an art student, before I was even really thinking of making films, I used to be part of a performance art group in London, which is called the Theatre of Mistakes. And we used slow motion and durational work a lot in the pieces that we did. And then after a while, like this group was initially made up of artists who wanted to extend the work they made into a performance arena. And then after a while, that group, some of them wanted to professionalize it and become a proper group, a proper theatre group. And I didn't want to go that far with it, but I remember it being a formative period and really taking on what tempo and timing, what it meant, like how you could work with it as an element. So then around the time of Anne Devlin, I was also looking at Tarkovsky because Maeve, because it's Brecht and the influences Brecht and Godard, like I was thinking very much about editing, how meaning is like created out of a dialectic of putting two blocks of scenes together and how they're in conversation with each other. And then through looking, I guess, at Tarkovsky and the way he uses duration on screen, I began to really see that what he was doing was saying that the meaning is within the scene itself. It doesn't, which in a sense is live, because something is on, okay, all film is dead. You know, you're looking at something that happened ages ago. But when you're looking at a scene that's durational, you're sharing that time with the performers and the camera.
A good example of that is the extended interrogation
Exactly.
of Anne Devlin by
Yes.
Major Sir,
Yes.
which doesn't do the usual cut back and forth
Yes.
between the people, but the camera almost imperceptibly moves slower
Yes,
and slower.
very slow
Really
track.
powerful scene for anybody who
Yeah.
saw it last night. And that kind of aesthetic is carried throughout Anne Devlin, lots of long shots and time.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a different view of, like, I guess what I was thinking about, it's a period film, and what do we know about what that period looks like? So what we know is the paintings. Barry Lyndon had been made, so I realized I had to make a film that looked as good as Barry Lyndon, but was like a fraction of the cost. But also this sense of inviting people into this other world where everything was quite slowed down. So where you're not manipulated by the cut, you know, where you have time to look around inside a shot. So looking at it last night, I think that atmosphere thing kind of works, you know.
And maybe before we talk about Nora, then your third film made in Ireland, just talk about your feminism, because I mean, we talked about this earlier. I was struck recently. I saw an interview with very recent interview with Bernadette Devlin, and she talked about how when the civil rights movement happened in Derry, her politics were already inside her because her mother ran a refuge for battered wives. You know, within the nationalist community, you know, it was fairly endemic that men would beat their wives, and her mother, who was widowed, ran a safe house and would stand up to the men. So by the time the civil rights thing kicked off, she said all it did was give her a language that was already within her to articulate what she knew was right. In terms of you growing up in Belfast, was it similar?
No, I didn't have those kinds of experiences. Like actually on like frontline experiences, like either in terms of violence against women or like one was seeing things on the streets and it was difficult, but I wasn't. The situation was very restricted, but those kinds of experiences that Bernadette had, I didn't have. Like really, for me, growing up, the feminism didn't come until I started making films, because like when I was growing up, like I guess in a family of sisters, like I wasn't in a situation where there were brothers who might have been privileged more than we were, so there was nothing sort of to stop our worldview that we could do what we wanted. So like we all wanted to be artists, and then when I was like making art and then moved to London, there's this drift into performance art, and then what was going on among women artists was fascinating, like really, really interesting. So then when I started to make films, you're kind of noticing that there's two ways to go. One is through the industry way, where you start these long apprenticeships, and then you're really aware there's no women. There's no women, and that a lot of the skills that were imparted are done by guys in the pub. It's a kind of a closed shop, and it would be many years before you would get to shoot something. Whereas this world of experimental filmmaking was much more conducive to women's work. And so I started to make these experimental films, and then became a little dissatisfied with that world, which was around the London Filmmakers Co-op, and then in New York with the anthology, the Anthology Film Archives Millennium. Even though it was an extraordinary time, I kind of reached the point where I felt, I don't know how to describe this because I don't know how to make myself clear, but there was a sort of a sense in which this kind of formal experimentation, like particularly in England, where there was like a school of landscape film, structuralist film, that it didn't really offer anywhere to go. Like once you started to work this way, it didn't feel to me that there was really a route that one could develop work through. So when I started to make Maeve, and it became about storytelling, the idea of being able to actually put a narrative together, that was immensely liberating. But also I remember like there were other women in other worlds working in this way. Like there was an American performance artist called Alexis Hunter, who showed in the Ileana Sonnabend Gallery, and she did one night of telling stories from Scheherazade as a performance. So Joan Jonas was doing art performances that were based on folktales. Not so much in that kind of just, yes, Yvonne, but Yvonne was very structurally based, I think. Yeah. Whereas like what Joan Jonas is doing is presenting these folk tales but fused through an art performance sensibility. So that became my route in a way. And then I guess the BFI, like I would think once you start making a narrative film, then that becomes a way forward.
Maybe this is a good time now to talk about Nora, because it did represent, it's a slightly different time. Ireland was changing, and bravely you took on the Joyce industry, which is, he's second to God in Ireland, as you know.
Yes, okay. Well, I think what happens is you grow up in Ireland, you're reading Joyce. He's the giant on your shoulder. And I remember these experimental little films that I was making when I was an art student. People used to say, oh, they're Joycean, because there was all this stream of consciousness, chopped up language and these images. And I would go, are they? I don't know. Like, I would like them to be, but I don't really think they are. And so then when I started looking at films that were from Joyce's work, I didn't love them. You know, I thought there's something in them that's not, you know, maybe they're not filmable or something. I don't know. Like, even though stories like Dubliners seem to be like straightforward stories, in fact, they're not. You know, they're so packed with so much going on that I don't know how they can unfold on a narrative level. So I always wanted to do something of Joyce's work and was too fearful of it. And then I read Brenda Maddox's book, and then I just thought, okay, I can really do something with this. And I was shocked by the extent to which I had made the same mistake that everybody had about Nora, of thinking like how great he was to stick with this woman who somehow entrapped him, you know. Like, I really, you know, like if you read Elman, that's kind of implicit, you know, that she's not considered that important at all. But when you read Brenda Maddox, like, the great thing that she did is not sort of deify Nora, but actually show the extent to which they were together all the time, and show the extent to which her voice is fused in his writing. And this is not to say ever that she was a writer and that he took that away from her. It's not at all about that, because I don't think she would ever have been an artist, or would. It's not like that. So for me, like, that became my way of looking at him. And then also so much of his work, like as a novelist, so little of it is fictionalized, you know? Like, a lot of it is so much based on things that happened and from his life in Dublin and encounters he had in Trieste. And then also the other thing that I was interested in is that actually Dublin and Paris are seen as the great, in those, like 20 years ago, up until 20 years ago, Dublin and Paris were seen as the great Joycean cities. Whereas I actually think Trieste is the great Joycean city. And when I went there to walk around, and I was actually very lonely, you know, I'd gone there on my own, and it was the winter, and I was walking around. And so there's all these voices going on, like there's all these languages, there's Trestino, Italian, Serbo-Croat, Slovenian, Russian, Greek. And you think, this was what they were hearing, you know, this is sort of the language that they were hearing. So you begin to have this sense of Trieste as Middle Europa and the center of that world. And it's always fascinating to me that when they emigrate, they don't go to London or New York, they go to deeper into Europe, you know. Anyway.
I'm conscious of time, so
sorry.
As we wrap up, maybe talk about your other film, the one that was made in India, and maybe the project you're working on now.
Okay. I won't talk about the project I'm working on now because it's blocked, and it kind of, I don't know whether it's going to happen or not. But in India, like, I've been going to India for quite a while, and I have a friend called Annie Dibble, who is a weaver and a textiles researcher. So we would go there really in a Buddhist context, like we've been going for, a long time. And then she would split off and do her own thing. Like, once she went to Nepal and went on a plane and then walked for a week, 20 miles a day, to find this group of people who were weaving nettles and who had a whole world built up out of this weaving. But then once she came back and she showed me photographs that she had taken in Varanasi, and the photograph that she showed just, I thought, was startling. It was of a very poorly dressed man sitting at a gigantic jacquard loom that looked like a Richard Serra sculpture. It was so big. His feet are down in a pit, and it's a very poor-looking room with a naked light bulb, but what he's weaving is like treasure. Like, he was weaving a silk weaver. So then I said to her, Annie, you know, like, I could make a little film for you for your lectures. You know, like, we could do something with this. And so then we went together to Varanasi to research it, and then it grew, like, it became a feature documentary. So what it's about is, roughly, it's kind of presented as a day in the life of this Muslim weaving community in Varanasi. So I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's an ancient city on the Ganges. It's considered to be the seat of Hinduism, and people who are Hindu go there to bathe in the Ganges and to visit the temples, and also to die, like to be burnt on the ghats. So there's this whole extraordinary experience of entering this city, which is dedicated to the Lord Shiva, who is the Lord of chaos, and the city is filthy and chaotic. But behind the ghats, there's this other reality, which is the Muslim world of the silk weavers. And they are the engine that keep this city going. It's through their work and the wealth of their work. They produce the wealth that keeps this city going. So there's this strange synergy goes on between Muslim and Hindu that doesn't go on anywhere else really in India. And it has to do with the fact that the Muslims are the artists and the weavers, and they are weaving saris and fabrics for Hindus to use. So the film becomes about that, really. Yeah, it's very beautiful. I'm very proud of it, actually, that one. Yeah.
Well, that's maybe a good way to end and invite.
Thank you very much. I think I've talked too much.